The shuttle bay of the Galactic Combat Institute stretched out like a metallic cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows that even the advanced alien lighting couldn't fully penetrate. Sarah Chen stepped off the transport vessel, her worn combat boots making a hollow sound against the gleaming floor that seemed to absorb and reflect sound in impossible ways. The air tasted different here, recycled through systems designed for a dozen different atmospheric requirements, carrying the faint metallic tang of ozone and something that reminded her of burnt copper. Around her, beings that looked like they'd stepped out of humanity's wildest nightmares moved with casual grace. A creature that resembled a walking tree made of crystalline bone clicked past on legs that bent in 3 directions. Something that might have been a cross between a giant mantis and an oil slick flowed along the wall, its surface rippling with colors that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere, the hum of translation devices worked overtime, turning alien languages into comprehensible speech that still somehow retained an otherworldly quality. Sarah had seen the recruitment videos, of course. Earth's government had made sure every potential candidate understood what they were signing up for. The Galactic Combat Institute was the most prestigious military training facility in known space, accepting only the finest warriors from hundreds of worlds. Graduation guaranteed a position in the Galactic Defense Corps, the elite force that protected civilized space from the horrors that lurked in the dark between stars. What the videos hadn't prepared her for was the sheer scale of everything. The corridors were built to accommodate beings 20 feet tall, making her feel like a child wandering through a giant's house. Gravity here was set to what the aliens called standard, roughly Earth normal, though Sarah could feel subtle differences in how her inner ear processed balance. The air was a little too thick, a little too humid, carrying scents and sounds that her brain couldn't quite categorize. A holographic display materialized in front of her as she reached what appeared to be a central processing area. The projection showed a vaguely humanoid figure with too many joints and skin that shifted between green and purple depending on the angle. Cadet Chen, Sarah. Species, human. Origin, Sol 3. Also known as Earth. The voice came from speakers embedded in the walls, speaking perfect English with just enough alien inflection to remind her she was very far from home. Welcome to the Galactic Combat Institute. Please proceed to Medical Bay 7 for standard processing and evaluation. Sarah nodded to the hologram, though she wasn't sure if the gesture meant anything to alien observers. She'd been briefed on some basic galactic etiquette, but 3 weeks of crash courses could only cover so much. The truth was, humans were so new to galactic civilization that most species had only theoretical knowledge about them. Earth had been discovered by accident when a Rigelian trade convoy had to make emergency repairs in the Sol system. The discovery of an intelligent species on a planet that galactic surveys had classified as uninhabitable death world had caused quite a stir in certain academic circles. The medical bay turned out to be a sterile white chamber filled with scanning equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. A tall, thin alien with grey skin and 4 arms gestured for her to stand in the center of a circular platform. This was a Vextai, according to her briefing materials. One of the most common species in the galaxy, known for their medical expertise and absolute attention to detail. Please remain still, the Vextai said, its voice carrying the whistling undertones typical of its species. We will now perform baseline scans to establish your physical parameters for training purposes. Beams of light played over Sarah's body, tickling her skin with sensations that ranged from warm to slightly electric. She tried to stay relaxed as the alien's 4 hands danced over control panels, recording data that probably contained more information about her body than any Earth doctor had ever compiled. Interesting, the Vextai murmured, looking at readings that meant nothing to Sarah. Your bone density is significantly higher than projections based on your homeworld's gravity. Muscle fiber arrangement suggests adaptation for explosive movement rather than sustained effort. And your cardiovascular system, the alien paused, manipulating controls to run the scan again. Are you certain you have not undergone genetic enhancement? Pretty sure, Sarah replied. Though my great-grandmother always said our family was part Ukrainian farm stock and part Detroit steelworker. Maybe that counts for something. The Vextai's head tilted in a way that suggested confusion, but it simply made notes and continued the examination. When the physical scans were complete, it handed her a device that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a piece of jewelry. This is your personal interface unit, it explained. It will provide translation services, access to facility maps and schedules, and serve as your identifier for all systems. Please place it against your left temple. Sarah pressed the device to her head as instructed. There was a brief tingling sensation, and then suddenly the constant background hum of alien voices became comprehensible. She could hear conversations in dozens of languages, all automatically translated into English in real time. More importantly, she could understand the Vexte without the slight delay she'd been experiencing. Excellent. Your orientation schedule has been uploaded to your unit. Your first session is Combat Fundamentals with Instructor Zektar in 30 standard minutes. Please note that all training exercises are conducted at full intensity. The Institute does not provide practice versions of combat scenarios. Sarah thanked the medic and made her way through corridors that seemed to shift and change as her interface unit updated its map. Other cadets moved past her, beings that ranged from almost human-looking to creatures that challenged her understanding of what constituted a life form. A few glanced at her with what might have been curiosity, but most ignored her entirely. The Combat Fundamentals training arena turned out to be a vast circular space with a floor that looked like polished obsidian. The ceiling was transparent, showing a view of stars that moved slowly past as the station rotated. Around the edges of the arena, seating areas provided space for observers, though only a handful of cadets were present to watch. Instructor Zektar stood in the center of the arena, and Sarah understood immediately why the Thraxians were considered among the finest warriors in the galaxy. He was roughly humanoid but scaled to intimidating proportions. 8 feet tall, with shoulders that could have supported bridge cables. His skin was a deep blue-green, marked with intricate silver patterns that seemed to move when he shifted position. Most striking of all was the weapon at his side, a sword that looked like it was made of crystallized starlight, its edge so sharp it seemed to cut reality itself. Today we begin with fundamental blade work, Zektar announced, his voice carrying easily across the arena despite speaking in what Sarah's translator identified as normal conversational tones. Combat in space often occurs in confined areas where energy weapons are impractical. Blade work remains relevant because it is silent, requires no ammunition, and functions regardless of environmental conditions. He drew his sword in a motion so fluid it barely registered as movement. The weapon sang as it cut through air, producing harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. "This is a quantum-edge blade," he continued, holding the sword so its edge caught the starlight from above. The cutting surface exists in a state of molecular uncertainty, allowing it to slice through most known materials at the subatomic level. Proper technique with such a weapon can cut through starship hulls. Sarah raised her hand. "Instructor, what do we do if we don't have access to quantum-edge weapons?" Zektar's head turned toward her, and she caught her first good look at his eyes, solid black, like looking into the void between stars. "An excellent question, cadet." He paused, consulting a device on his wrist. "Chen, the answer is that improvised weapons must be used with perfect technique to overcome their material limitations. Observe. What happened next would have been impossible to follow without the combat analysis subroutines built into her interface unit." Zektar moved through a series of sword forms that flowed like water and struck like lightning. His blade carved patterns in the air that seemed to hang there for a moment before fading, and Sarah realized she was watching techniques perfected over centuries of warfare. "Now," Zektar said, his breathing completely unchanged despite the display that would have left most beings exhausted. "We will practice basic defensive positions. Partner with the cadet nearest you and begin with simple parrying exercises." Sarah looked around and found herself facing a being that looked like it was made of living rock, with gems embedded in its surface that glowed with internal light. This was a crystallian, her interface informed her. Silicon-based life forms, known for their patience and methodical approach to problems. "I am Kethvar," her partner said, its voice sounding like gravel in a cement mixer. "I have studied your species files. Your physical capabilities appear limited compared to most warrior races." "Thanks for the pep talk," Sarah replied, accepting a practice sword from a rack along the arena wall. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, balanced differently than any blade she'd trained with back home. "I'll try not to disappoint you." The crystallian activated its own practice weapon, a blade that seemed to be grown from the same material as its body. "I meant no offense. I simply wish to adjust my technique to avoid injury. Your skeletal structure appears quite fragile." Sarah took a basic guard position, trying to remember the sword work she'd learned in her military training. The human military had included blade combat in their curriculum specifically to prepare candidates for the Institute, though she was beginning to suspect that Earth's understanding of alien fighting techniques had some significant gaps. "Begin," Zektar called out. Kethvar moved with surprising speed for a being made of stone, its blade sweeping towards Sarah in a careful, controlled arc. She parried automatically, feeling the impact travel up her arms. The crystallian had been holding back significantly. The strike had felt like sparring with a particularly gentle training partner. You may increase intensity, Sarah said. I'm not as fragile as I look. The crystalline's gems pulsed brighter, which her interface identified as amusement. Very well. Please inform me if the exercise becomes uncomfortable. The next strike came faster and harder. Sarah caught it on the 40 of her blade, redirecting the energy and countering with a thrust that HFY deflected with ease. They settled into a rhythm: attack, parry, counterattack, reset. It was similar enough to human sword work that Sarah could follow along, though she quickly noticed that alien fighting techniques relied heavily on reach and strength advantages that humans simply didn't possess. Around them, other pairs were engaged in similar exercises. A creature that looked like a cross between a spider and a snake worked with a being that appeared to be made of living liquid metal. Two aliens that might have been distant cousins of Earth's octopi flowed around each other in a display that was more like dancing than fighting. Interesting, HFY said as they paused between exercises. Your technique compensates for physical limitations with superior speed and unpredictability. Most impressive. Sarah was about to respond when Instructor Zektar's voice boomed across the arena. Cadet Chen, step forward. Every conversation in the arena stopped. Sarah felt dozens of alien eyes focusing on her as she walked toward the center of the training space. Zektar stood waiting, his quantum-edge sword held in a casual guard position. Your partner reports that you have adapted quickly to alien fighting techniques, the instructor said. This suggests either exceptional natural ability or prior training with non-human combat methods. Which is correct? Neither, sir, Sarah replied. This is my first time training with alien techniques. I'm just trying to adapt as I go. Zektar's black eyes studied her for a long moment. Demonstrate your natural fighting ability. Attack me with full intensity. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Sir, I'm using a practice blade and you have a quantum-edge weapon that can cut through starship hulls. The weapon will not activate its cutting field unless I will it to do so. You are in no danger from the blade itself. Zektar shifted into a ready position that somehow looked both relaxed and lethal. However, I will not be holding back my physical capabilities. Attack me as if your life depends on it. The arena had gone completely silent. Sarah could feel the weight of attention from every being present, and she realized this wasn't just a training exercise. This was some kind of test or demonstration, though she had no idea what she was supposed to prove. She thought about the briefing she'd received before leaving Earth. Humans were considered a minor species, barely worth notice except as a curiosity. Most galactic citizens saw them as soft creatures from an easy world, lacking the natural weapons and armor that evolution had granted to real warrior species. The few humans who had attempted to join galactic military organizations had generally washed out during basic training. Sarah gripped her practice sword tighter and made her decision. If she was going to fail, she might as well fail spectacularly. She attacked with everything she had, channeling years of military training and the kind of desperate aggression that humans specialized in. Her blade moved in patterns that prioritized speed over power, mixing techniques from half a dozen Earth martial traditions. She threw feints and combination attacks that would have been risky against a human opponent and were probably suicidal against an 8-foot alien warrior. Zektar met every attack effortlessly. His blade moved like liquid starlight, always exactly where it needed to be to deflect her strikes. His footwork was perfect, maintaining distance and angle with mathematical precision. Sarah quickly realized she wasn't just being outfought, she was being studied. The Thraxian was cataloging her capabilities, learning her patterns, probably building a complete profile of human combat abilities based on her performance. The realization made her angry. Not the hot, impulsive anger that led to mistakes, but the cold, calculating fury that her drill sergeants had taught her to use as a weapon. If this alien wanted to study human fighting techniques, she'd give him something worth studying. Sarah shifted her approach entirely. Instead of trying to match Zektar's formal technique, she started fighting dirty. She used her smaller size to get inside his reach, targeted joints and balance points, and combined her blade work with kicks and elbows that weren't part of any formal sword fighting curriculum. This was street fighting with a sword, the kind of combat that humans had perfected in thousands of years of warfare, where survival mattered more than honor. For the first time since the exercise began, Zektar had to actually work to defend himself. His black eyes widened slightly as Sarah's practice blade got past his guard and tapped against his ribs. A strike that would have been lethal with a real weapon. Fascinating, the instructor murmured. Then he moved. Sarah had thought Zektar was fighting at full speed, but she'd been wrong. His previous movements had been casual demonstrations of technique. What happened next was a master warrior fighting for real. His quantum-edge sword moved faster than her eyes could track, cutting patterns in the air that seemed to leave glowing after images. Sarah's practice blade was suddenly not in her hands anymore. She wasn't even sure how he'd disarmed her. She found herself on the defensive with no weapon, facing 8 feet of alien warrior whose sword could cut through steel. This should have been the moment when the exercise ended, when Zektar called a halt and critiqued her performance. Instead, his sword continued its deadly arc, aimed directly at her head at full combat speed. Later, Sarah would never be able to explain what happened next. She didn't think, didn't plan, didn't make any conscious decision. Her hand simply moved, catching the impossible blade between her palm and fingers like she was catching a fly. The quantum-edge sword stopped dead in her grip. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the arena was absolutely silent. Then there was a sound like breaking crystal, and Zektar's weapon, the blade that could cut through starship hulls, snapped in half. Sarah stood there holding a piece of crystallized starlight that was slowly fading back to ordinary metal. Around the arena, aliens made sounds of shock and disbelief in dozens of different languages, and Instructor Zektar, master warrior of the Thraxian Empire, stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. "What?" he said very quietly. "Did you just do?" Sarah stood in the center of the arena, still holding the broken pieces of what had been a weapon capable of cutting through starship hulls. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable, then moved well past uncomfortable, into the realm of absolutely surreal. Around her, beings from dozens of worlds stared with expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to what might have been fear. "I asked you a question, Cadet Chen," Zektar said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "What did you just do to my blade?" Sarah looked down at the broken weapon in her hands. The quantum-edge technology had completely failed, leaving her holding what appeared to be ordinary metal that was still warm to the touch. The break was clean, too clean, as if the molecular bonds had simply decided to stop working. "I caught it," she said, aware of how inadequate that sounded. "You were swinging it at my head, so I caught it. You caught a quantum-edge blade with your bare hand while it was operating at full cutting power." Zektar's voice had taken on the careful tone of someone trying to understand an impossible situation. "Do you comprehend what that means?" Sarah was beginning to get an idea, and she didn't like where her thoughts were heading. "I'm guessing it's not supposed to be possible. It is not supposed to be possible for any known form of matter to interrupt a quantum edge field through direct contact," Zektar said. "The cutting field exists in a state of molecular uncertainty that should phase through normal matter. Only specially designed containment fields can safely interact with the technology." He gestured for her to hand him the broken weapon. Sarah passed over the pieces, noting that his hands were shaking slightly as he examined them. For a warrior who had faced hundreds of battles without flinching, he looked genuinely unsettled. "The quantum matrix has been completely destabilized," he announced to the silent arena. "Not damaged or disrupted, destabilized. The molecular structure appears to have been convinced that it was ordinary steel instead of exotic matter." A new voice spoke from the arena's entrance. "That should not be possible with any known technology." Everyone turned to see a figure that Sarah's interface unit identified as Director Vashtar, the commanding officer of the entire Galactic Combat Institute. She was Thraxian like Zektar, but older and more heavily scarred, with silver patterns that moved across her skin like living circuitry. Her presence commanded immediate attention from every being in the arena. "Director," Zektar said, offering a formal salute. "I was conducting a standard evaluation exercise when this anomaly occurred." Director Vashtar approached the center of the arena, her black eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. "Show me your hands, Cadet." Sarah held out her hands, palms up. The director pulled out a scanner that looked like it belonged in the medical bay and ran it over Sarah's skin. The device made soft beeping sounds and displayed readings that meant nothing to Sarah but clearly meant a great deal to the director.
"No energy signatures.
No technological implants, no exotic matter contamination." Vashtar looked at the readings again, then ran the scanner a second time. "By all measurements, these are ordinary biological appendages from a standard carbon-based life form." She turned to address the assembled cadets. "All of you will report to your quarters immediately. Discuss nothing of what you have witnessed here with anyone. Instructor Zektar, remain behind. Cadet Chen, you will accompany me." The arena cleared quickly, though Sarah caught glimpses of several cadets pausing to stare at her as they left. She had a feeling this incident was going to follow her for the rest of her time at the Institute, assuming she was allowed to stay. Director Vashtar led Sarah through corridors she hadn't seen before, deeper into the station's administrative sections. The walls here were covered with what appeared to be battle honors, displays showing significant conflicts from galactic history, memorials to fallen warriors, and weapons from famous campaigns. "Do you know why the Galactic Combat Institute exists, Cadet Chen?" the director asked as they walked. "To train elite warriors for the Galactic Defense Corps," Sarah replied, giving the answer from her orientation materials. "That is the official purpose, yes. But the true reason is far more important." Vashtar stopped in front of a display showing a star map marked with red zones. "We exist because there are things in the dark between stars that should not be allowed to reach civilized space. Entities that feed on life itself, consume worlds for amusement, or simply destroy everything they encounter for reasons we cannot comprehend." Sarah studied the map, noting how many red zones there were compared to the areas marked as safe space. "How long has this been going on?" "Since before your species developed agriculture. The galaxy is not a safe place, Cadet. We maintain the illusion of safety for the trillions of beings who live in protected space. But the reality is that we are surrounded by horrors that would drive most sapient minds to madness simply by witnessing them." They entered what appeared to be the director's private office, a space filled with artifacts from dozens of different worlds. Sarah recognized a few items that looked vaguely similar to Earth weapons, but most were alien designs that hurt to look at directly. "Sit," Vashtar commanded, gesturing to a chair that adjusted itself to accommodate Sarah's human physiology. "We need to discuss what just happened in that arena." Sarah settled into the chair, which was surprisingly comfortable despite being designed for beings with completely different anatomy. "I'm not sure I understand it myself, Director. I've never done anything like that before." "Describe your sensation when you caught the blade. Be precise." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember. It felt wrong somehow, like the sword wasn't what it appeared to be. For just a moment it seemed like it was just ordinary metal painted to look fancy, and then it was ordinary metal. Like the universe had decided to agree with me. Director Vashtar leaned back in her chair, her silver patterns shifting to configurations that suggested deep thought. "Tell me about your homeworld, Cadet. Not the official reports. Your personal perspective." Sarah wasn't sure where this was leading, but the director's tone suggested this wasn't really a request. "Earth is challenging. The environment tries to kill you in about a dozen different ways. Weather that can freeze or cook you. Animals that evolved specifically to be better at killing than anything else around them. Diseases that adapt faster than we can develop treatments. Yet humans thrived in this environment. More than thrived. We turned it into an advantage. Humans are persistence hunters. We don't have claws or fangs or armor, but we can run prey to exhaustion over distances that would kill most predators. We're social pack hunters who learn to use tools and cooperation to overcome everything from saber-toothed cats to ice ages. And how do humans typically respond to impossible situations?" Sarah thought about that. "We ignore the impossible part and solve the problem anyway. When our ancestors needed to cross oceans, they built boats out of trees. When they needed to fly, they built machines. When they needed to reach the stars, they strapped themselves to controlled explosions and hoped for the best."
Exactly. Vashtar stood and walked to a window that looked out at the starfield beyond the station.
"Most species accept the limitations of reality because their evolution taught them that fighting impossible odds leads to extinction. Humans evolved in an environment where impossible odds were Tuesday afternoon." She turned back to Sarah. "I believe what happened in that arena was your species' unique approach to problem solving applied to exotic physics. You were faced with a weapon that should have killed you, so you simply refused to accept that it could." "That sounds completely insane," Sarah said. "Yes, it does. Which brings us to the real problem." Vashtar returned to her desk and activated a holographic display showing what appeared to be incident reports. "This is the third time in galactic history that someone has demonstrated the ability to alter fundamental physical laws through force of will alone." The display showed two other cases. The first involves something called the Void Touched, beings who had survived direct exposure to entities from dark space and returned with abilities that violated known physics. The second case involved an ancient race called the Primordials, who had apparently been able to rewrite reality on a whim before mysteriously disappearing millions of years ago. "Both previous cases led to galactic catastrophes," Vashtar continued. The void touched became conduits for entities that consume 17 star systems before they could be stopped. The primordials, well, nobody knows exactly what happened to them, but their former territory is still quarantined as a dead zone where physics behaves unpredictably. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. Are you saying I'm some kind of threat to galactic civilization? I'm saying that we need to understand what you represent before making any decisions. There are protocols for dealing with reality-altering phenomena, but they are extreme. Vashtar's patterns shifted to what Sarah was learning to recognize as regret. The standard response is immediate termination and incineration of all organic matter within a 50-kilometer radius. That seems like an overreaction. Tell that to the 17 star systems that no longer exist. Vashtar sat down again. However, I am willing to explore alternatives, provided you agree to certain conditions. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. First, you will continue your training at the Institute under close supervision. Any further reality-altering incidents will be immediately reported and analyzed. Second, you will undergo extensive testing to determine the nature and scope of your abilities. Third, you will submit to memory engrams that will allow us to study your thought processes during anomalous events. And if I refuse, then Protocol 7 goes into effect and this entire station gets evacuated before we sterilize it from orbit. Vashtar's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing dinner plans. I would prefer to avoid that outcome. Sarah considered her options, which seemed to range from bad to catastrophically worse. What exactly would this testing involve? We have facilities designed to safely contain reality-altering phenomena. You would work with our top xenopsychologists and theoretical physicists to understand how your abilities function. The process would be educational for both of us. And if you decide I'm too dangerous, then we implement Protocol 7. Vashtar's patterns shifted to what might have been sympathy. I will not lie to you, Cadet. The risks involved are significant, but the potential benefits to galactic civilization could be immense. Sarah thought about her options. She could refuse and probably trigger the immediate destruction of everything within 50 kilometers, including herself and hundreds of innocent cadets. Or she could agree to become a test subject in experiments involving forces that had previously led to galactic catastrophes. There's a third option, she said slowly. I'm listening. You said the problem with the previous cases was that they led to galactic catastrophes. But you also said that humans approach impossible problems differently than other species. Sarah leaned forward. What if the solution isn't to contain or eliminate reality-altering abilities, but to understand and control them? Vashtar's patterns brightened with interest. Elaborate. Humans have a long history of taking dangerous forces and turning them into tools. Fire can burn down forests, but we use it to cook food and forge metal. Electricity can kill you, but we use it to power our civilization. Nuclear fission can destroy cities, but we also use it to generate power. You're suggesting that reality alteration could be weaponized. I'm suggesting it could be civilized.
Sarah chose her words carefully.
The entities from dark space that you're fighting, they operate by rules that normal physics can't counter. But if humans can alter physical laws, maybe we can develop countermeasures that work on the same level. The director was quiet for a long moment, her patterns shifting through configurations that Sarah couldn't interpret. That is either brilliant or catastrophically naive. Maybe both. But it's better than sterilizing star systems every time someone demonstrates unusual abilities. Vashtar stood and walked to another window. This one showing a view of the station's training facilities. In the distance, Sarah could see ships arriving and departing, cadets from dozens of worlds coming to learn the arts of war. Very well, Cadet Chen. I will authorize a modified research protocol. You will work with our science teams to develop controlled applications of your abilities, with the eventual goal of creating countermeasures against dark space entities. She turned back to Sarah. But understand that this is uncharted territory. We have no idea what we might discover. That's fine, Sarah said. Humans are good at improvising. I hope you're right, because if this goes wrong, the consequences could make the previous catastrophes look like minor inconveniences. Vashtar activated her communication system and began issuing orders. Sarah was assigned new quarters in a specialized wing of the station, with monitoring equipment that would track everything from her brain patterns to local gravitational fluctuations. She would continue regular combat training, but with additional sessions focused on understanding and controlling her reality-altering abilities. As Sarah left the director's office, she caught a reflection of herself in one of the polished wall surfaces. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. A human woman from Earth, unremarkable in every visible way. But she was beginning to understand that visible appearances might not tell the whole story. The corridor outside was empty except for gleaming drones that skittered along the walls like mechanical insects. Sarah made her way toward her new quarters, her mind racing with implications she was only beginning to grasp. She thought about the broken quantum-edge sword, about the fear in alien eyes, about protocols that involve sterilizing entire star systems. Most of all, she thought about the entities lurking in dark space, the horrors that had been threatening galactic civilization since before humans learned to make fire. Maybe it was time the galaxy met something scarier than the things that lived in the dark. Maybe it was time the galaxy met humanity. 3 weeks after the incident with the quantum edge blade, Sarah found herself strapped to what looked like a torture device, designed by aliens with a very specific understanding of human anatomy. The testing apparatus surrounded her with sensors, field generators, and monitoring equipment that hummed with energies she could feel in her bones. Dr. Keshara, the Institute's leading xenophysicist, made final adjustments to the control panel while muttering in her native language. She was Rigelian, tall, thin, with skin that shifted between blue and silver, depending on her emotional state. Right now, her coloration suggested intense concentration mixed with barely controlled excitement. This test will be different from our previous attempts, Dr. J. Keshara explained, her 4 hands dancing over controls with practiced precision. We have learned much about your abilities over the past weeks, but we still do not understand the mechanism by which you alter physical laws. Sarah shifted in the restraints, trying to find a comfortable position. The previous tests had been increasingly elaborate attempts to trigger her reality-altering abilities under controlled conditions. Most had failed completely. The few successes had been minor. Convincing a steel bar that it was made of rubber, making a gravity field forget which direction was down, persuading a laser beam that it was actually made of water. What makes this one special? Sarah asked. We are going to attempt to recreate the exact conditions of your encounter with Instructor Zektar's blade. Keshara's skin shifted toward the blue end of the spectrum, indicating nervousness. We have constructed a quantum-edge field generator that can produce a cutting beam equivalent to a masterclass weapon. Sarah felt her stomach drop. And you want me to catch it with my bare hand again? Not exactly. We want you to stop it with your mind while your hands remain safely restrained. Keshara activated a holographic display showing the test chamber. The beam will be aimed at a target positioned precisely where your head was during the original incident. If your abilities function, as we theorize, you should be able to alter the beam's properties without physical contact. And if they don't function the way you theorize, then the quantum edge beam will slice through the target, the back wall of the chamber, and likely several additional walls before dissipating. Keshara's skin had gone completely blue. We have evacuated the entire section of the station as a precautionary measure. Sarah looked around the test chamber, noting the massive blast doors and the fact that she was alone except for Keshara. Where is everyone else observing from? The central control bunker, approximately 2 kilometers away. Keshara finished her preparations and moved toward the chamber's exit. We will maintain communication through quantum-entangled channels that cannot be disrupted by reality alteration effects.
Wait!
Sarah called out. What if I can't do it? What if this ability only works when I'm actually in danger? Keshara paused at the door. Then we will have learned something valuable about the nature of your abilities. Science progresses through both successful and failed experiments, Cadet Chen. The door sealed with a sound like a bank vault closing, leaving Sarah alone with the humming machinery. Through the transparent aluminum viewing window, she could see the quantum edge field generator powering up. The device looked like a cannon designed by someone who understood physics better than sanity. All crystalline matrices and energy conduits that hurt to look at directly. Communication check, came Dr. Keshara's voice through speakers embedded in the walls. Can you hear me clearly, Cadet? Loud and clear, Doc. Are you sure about the evacuation radius? 2 kilometers seems optimistic if this goes wrong. The evacuation radius is based on the largest recorded reality-altering incident in galactic history, came a new voice. Director Vashtar had apparently decided to observe personally. If your abilities exceed that scale, the evacuation radius becomes irrelevant anyway. That's reassuring, Sarah muttered, testing the restraints one more time. They were designed to hold beings much stronger than humans, but they were also positioned so she could see the target clearly. The test designers had learned from previous experiments that her abilities seemed to require direct visual contact with whatever she was trying to affect. Beginning field generation sequence, Dr. Keshara announced. Quantum Edge Matrix will reach full power in 60 seconds. Sarah watched the weapon charge up, its crystalline structure beginning to glow with contained energy. She could feel something building in the air around her, a tension that had nothing to do with electromagnetic fields or exotic particles. It was the same sensation she'd felt in the arena just before catching Zektar's blade, like reality itself was holding its breath. 40 seconds to full power! All monitoring systems are recording, gravitational sensors are active. The field generator's glow was getting brighter, and Sarah could hear harmonics that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. This was definitely more powerful than the sword she'd caught 3 weeks ago. If her abilities didn't work, the resulting beam would indeed punch through multiple walls before dissipating. 20 seconds. Quantum matrix is stable. All personnel are clear of the danger zone. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember exactly what she'd felt when Zektar's sword had come toward her head. There had been no conscious thought, no deliberate decision to alter physical laws. She had simply seen a weapon that shouldn't exist and convinced the universe to agree with her. 10 seconds.
Field generator is at 95% power. Cadet Chen, are you ready?
As ready as I can be for something that violates the fundamental nature of reality,
Sarah replied.
3, 2, 1. Firing. The quantum edge beam launched from the generator like a spear of crystallized starlight, moving fast enough that Sarah's eyes barely registered it as motion. For an instant, she saw her death approaching, as a line of impossible energy that would slice through her target and everything beyond it without slowing down. Then she stopped seeing the beam as a weapon and started seeing it as a lie. The energy field was exotic matter held in a state of quantum uncertainty. But exotic matter was still matter. It obeyed rules, followed patterns, existed within the framework of physics. And physics, Sarah was beginning to understand, was really just a set of agreements about how things were supposed to work. The beam hit her target, and simply, stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed, not dispersed. It struck the metal plate and came to a complete halt, as if it had encountered something absolutely immovable. For a moment, the quantum edge field hung in the air like a frozen lightning bolt. Then it quietly faded back to ordinary photons and dissipated. The test chamber was completely silent except for the humming of monitoring equipment. Status report, came Director Vashtar's voice. All systems functional, Dr. Keshara replied, though her voice carried a note of awe. The quantum edge beam achieved full power and maintained coherence until it contacted the target. Then the exotic matter matrix spontaneously reverted to normal electromagnetic radiation. Gravitational readings? Local spacetime remained stable throughout the event. No exotic particle traces, no residual energy signatures. There was a pause as Keshara checked more readings. It's as if the beam simply decided to stop being a quantum edge field. Sarah slumped in her restraints, suddenly exhausted. Can someone let me out of this thing now? The chamber door opened and Dr. Keshara rushed in, followed by a small army of technicians with scanners and recording equipment. They swarmed around the target area, taking readings and collecting samples of metal that had been struck by a weapon capable of slicing through starship hulls and remained completely undamaged. Remarkable, Keshara said, studying her instruments. The target shows no signs of molecular disruption. The quantum edge beam appears to have been converted to ordinary light at the moment of contact. How? Director Vashtar asked as she entered the chamber. Unknown. Our sensors detected no energy expenditure from Cadet Chen, no exotic particle emissions, no gravitational anomalies. Keshara's skin had shifted to patterns Sarah had never seen before. Excitement so intense it overwhelmed her normal coloration. She altered fundamental forces through an unknown mechanism that our instruments cannot detect. Sarah was released from the restraints and immediately found herself surrounded by aliens with questions she couldn't answer. How did she do it? What did it feel like? Could she teach the technique to others? Could she do it with other types of exotic matter? I don't know, she answered to most questions. It doesn't feel like doing anything. It's more like remembering that something isn't real. That answer led to 3 hours of additional questioning. But Sarah couldn't explain it any better. To her, reality alteration felt like correcting a mistake rather than performing an action. When she looked at exotic matter fields or impossible physics, she could somehow see the places where the universe was pretending things worked differently than they actually did. Later that evening, Sarah found herself in the Institute's observation deck, looking out at the starfield beyond the station. The artificial day/night cycle had shifted to evening mode, dimming the lights and tinting the windows to approximate the warm glow of a planetary sunset. She wasn't alone. Instructor Zektar stood nearby, also gazing at the stars. His new sword, a replacement for the one she'd broken, hung at his side, its quantum edge field carefully contained. "I have been studying your species' history," he said without looking at her. "Your military records, your conflicts, your approach to warfare. Find anything interesting?" Humans appear to specialize in winning wars they should have lost. Zektar turned to face her. "Time after time, your species has faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through tactics that no rational military strategist would consider." Sarah thought about that. "We're good at improvising. It is more than improvisation. Your species approaches conflict from directions that other beings cannot anticipate because they are fundamentally irrational." Zektar's black eyes reflected the starlight. "You attack when you should retreat, defend positions that cannot be held, and refuse to accept defeat even when continued resistance is mathematically impossible." Is that a compliment or a criticism? It is an observation that may be relevant to our current situation. Zektar activated a holographic display showing the star map Sarah had seen in Director Vashtar's office. The entities we fight in dark space operate by similar principles. They ignore physical laws that should constrain them, employ tactics that make no rational sense, and refuse to be defeated by conventional military force. Sarah studied the map, noting how the red zone seemed to have expanded since she'd last seen it. "You're saying we need to fight crazy with crazy. I am saying that perhaps the galaxy's best hope against irrational enemies is an equally irrational ally." Zektar touched a control, and the map zoomed in on one of the red zones. "We have been fighting a defensive war for millennia, containing threats and minimizing losses, but containment is not victory." The display showed a dead star system, its planets reduced to floating debris by something that had consumed everything capable of supporting life. According to the data, this had happened less than 6 months ago. "What exactly are these entities?" Sarah asked. "We call them the Devourers, though they have appeared in our records under dozens of different names throughout history." Zektar switched to tactical displays showing encounter reports. They seem to exist partially outside normal space-time, which allows them to ignore most physical laws. They consume life energy on a massive scale, apparently for sustenance. And they appear to be intelligent, though their motivations are completely alien. Sarah watched video footage from various encounters, fleet engagements where entire battle groups simply vanished, planets that went dark in a matter of hours, space itself seeming to tear open and disgorge entities that hurt to look at directly. How do you usually fight them? Evacuation and containment. When a Devourer incursion occurs, we evacuate all life from the affected system and establish quarantine barriers using exotic matter fields. Zektar's pattern shifted to what Sarah was learning to recognize as frustration. The barriers hold for a while, but they eventually fail. The Devourers seem to learn how to bypass our defenses given sufficient time. Has anyone ever tried a direct assault? Many times. Conventional weapons pass through them without effect. Energy weapons are absorbed and turned back against us. Even exotic matter weapons like quantum edge blades cannot penetrate their defenses. Zektar deactivated the display. "We have lost thousands of ships and millions of lives attempting direct engagement." Sarah considered what she'd learned. Entities that existed partially outside normal physics, consumed life energy, and couldn't be harmed by conventional weapons. It sounded like a job for someone who could convince reality to work differently. "When do we leave?" she asked. Zektar's head tilted in surprise. "Leave for where?" "To fight these Devourers." That's what this conversation has been leading up to, right? You need someone who can alter physical laws to counter enemies that ignore physical laws. Cadet Chen, you have been at this institute for less than a month. You have completed virtually none of your training. You have no experience with actual combat against exotic entities. True. But I bet none of your experienced warriors can break quantum edge blades with their bare hands. Sarah turned from the window to face him directly.
Look, I know this is dangerous.
I know I could get killed or worse, turn into some kind of reality-warping monster that threatens galactic civilization. But people are dying while we sit here running tests and writing reports. The risks are the same, whether we wait 6 months or 6 years. These abilities aren't going away, and neither are the Devourers. Sarah thought about the dead star system on the map, of our planets reduced to floating debris. At least if we act now, we might save some lives. Zekar was quiet for a long moment, his pattern shifting through configurations she couldn't interpret. There is a situation developing in the Tertius system. Long-range sensors have detected preliminary signs of devourer activity. The evacuation fleet will depart in 72 hours. Evacuation fleet? Standard protocol. We evacuate all life from the system, establish quarantine barriers, and monitor the situation. His patterns shifted to what might have been hope. Perhaps this time we could try a different approach. Sarah felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with terror. This was what she'd come to the Institute for. Not to sit in classrooms learning alien military theory, but to make a real difference in the galaxy's fight against forces that threatened all intelligent life. I'll need combat gear appropriate for reality-altering operations, she said. There is no such thing. You would be the first being in galactic history to engage entities from dark space with abilities similar to their own. Then, I guess we'll have to improvise. Zektar's patterns shifted to what she was beginning to recognize as the Thraxian equivalent of a smile. Yes, I believe improvisation may be exactly what the galaxy needs. The evacuation fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Tertius system like metal predators materializing from a nightmare. Sarah watched from the bridge of the command vessel Stellar Argius, as hundreds of ships spread out in formation, their sensors immediately beginning deep scans of the inner system. What they found was worse than the preliminary reports had suggested. Devourer presence confirmed, announced the ship's tactical officer, a Crystallian whose gems were pulsing rapid distress patterns. Multiple contacts detected throughout the system. They appeared to be feeding. The main display showed what remained of the Tertius system. 3 of the 7 inhabited worlds were already dark, their surfaces covered with what looked like spreading shadows that consumed light itself. The remaining planets showed signs of active devourer activity. Cities going dark in expanding circles, orbital stations simply vanishing from sensors, space itself seeming to twist and fold in impossible ways. Admiral Thekaresh, the fleet commander, was a Vextai with the kind of scars that came from fighting things that shouldn't exist. His forearms moved across control panels with mechanical precision as he processed incoming reports. Civilian evacuation status, he asked. Ongoing, sir. We've established evacuation corridors to the outer planets, but... The communications officer hesitated. So, we're losing contact with transports as they approach the inner system. The Devourers appear to be targeting fleeing civilians specifically. Sarah felt her jaw clench. Everything she'd read about the Devourers suggested they were indiscriminate consumers of life energy, but this sounded like deliberate cruelty. Show me, Admiral Thekresh ordered. The tactical display switched to real-time feeds from the evacuation zone. Sarah watched in horror as transport ships simply winked out of existence when they came within range of the spreading darkness. Thousands of civilians, gone in seconds without any apparent weapon being fired. The Devourers are employing a new tactic, observed Dr. Mill. Keishara, who had insisted on joining the mission to study Sarah's abilities in actual combat, previous encounters showed random feeding patterns. This appears to be systematic hunting behavior. They're learning, Instructor Zekdar said grimly. He stood near the tactical station, his new quantum-edge sword secured at his side. Each encounter teaches them more about our responses and capabilities. Admiral Thekresh turned to Sarah. Cadet Chen, what do your enhanced senses tell you about the situation? Sarah had been studying the tactical displays with growing unease. The Devourer activity patterns looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with their violation of physical laws. The spreading darkness, the selective targeting of civilians, the way space itself seemed to recoil from their presence. It all felt like a performance designed to provoke a specific response. They're baiting us, she said. This isn't random feeding. They want us to come closer. For what purpose? The Admiral asked. Unknown. But they've positioned themselves to force us into a choice. Abandon the civilians to save the fleet, or commit the fleet to save the civilians and risk a trap. Admiral Thekresh studied the tactical situation. Standard doctrine called for immediate quarantine and withdrawal. Establish barriers around the affected system and monitor from a safe distance. Accept the losses and prevent the Devourers from spreading to other systems. But Sarah could see the conflict in his scarred features. The evacuation transports were still broadcasting distress signals. There were still civilians alive on the outer planets. Still time to save some of them if the fleet moved quickly. Admiral, Sarah said quietly. What if we split the difference? Explain. You continue the evacuation as planned. Establish your quarantine barriers. Follow all the protocols. Sarah gestured to the tactical display. But let me take a small team to the inner system and see if I can disrupt whatever the Devourers are planning. The bridge fell silent except for the humming of instruments and the distant vibration of the ship's engines. Every alien eye focused on Sarah with expressions that ranged from disbelief to horror. Absolutely not, Admiral Theckerus said firmly. You are untested in actual combat. Your abilities are not fully understood. The risk of losing our only reality-altering asset to enemy action is unacceptable. The risk of losing this entire fleet to a Devourer trap is also unacceptable, Sarah countered. At least my way, you keep the fleet intact while potentially saving the civilians. And if you are captured or corrupted by Devourer influence? Sarah thought about the briefings she'd received on Devourer corruption. Beings exposed to their influence could become conduits for entities from dark space, turning into weapons against their own people. But the corruption process seemed to affect beings who couldn't resist reality alteration. Then you follow Protocol 7 and sterilize the entire system, she said. Same as you'd do if I lost control during testing. Doctor. Keshara's skin had gone completely blue with nervousness. The theoretical risks of exposing reality-altering abilities to Devourer influence are completely unknown. We could be creating a weapon that makes their previous depredations look trivial. Or we could be creating the first effective countermeasure in galactic history. Sarah looked around the bridge. Look, I know the risks, but people are dying while we debate theory. Give me a fast ship and a small crew. If it goes wrong, you're already positioned to contain the damage. Instructor Zektar stepped forward. I volunteered to accompany Cadet Chen. Admiral Theckerus's forearms gestured in patterns that Sarah's interface identified as extreme exasperation. You would risk the life of one of our most experienced combat instructors on an untested cadet's theory? I would risk my life to save thousands of civilians and potentially acquire intelligence that could change the course of this war. Zektar's patterns were steady, showing calm determination. Besides, someone needs to observe and record whatever happens when human reality alteration encounters Devourer physics. I'll go too, Dr. Keshara announced, her skin shifting to patterns Sarah had learned to associate with scientific determination overcoming fear.
If we're going to violate every safety protocol in existence, we might as well gather useful data while we do it.
The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical display. More transport ships were disappearing as they approached the inner system.
The civilian death toll was climbing by the thousands. Very well, he said finally. But we do this properly. You'll take the scout ship Quantum Dart. Fast, stealthy, and equipped with the best sensors we have. Your mission is strictly reconnaissance and civilian rescue. If you encounter direct Devourer resistance, you withdraw immediately. Understood, Sarah said, though she suspected the actual mission would be more complicated than reconnaissance. 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself aboard a ship that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that sometimes the laws of physics were more like guidelines. The Quantum Dart was roughly the size of an Earth fighter jet, but its internal space had been folded through dimensional manipulation to accommodate a crew of 6. The bridge, engine room and crew quarters existed in spaces that were technically the same location, but accessed through different dimensional angles. This is going to take some getting used to, Sarah said as she strapped herself into the pilot's seat. The ship's controls were designed for Thraxian physiology, but they'd been modified with interfaces that could respond to human neural patterns. The dimensional folding becomes intuitive after a few hours, Zektar assured her from the co-pilot's position. Assuming you don't think about it too hard. Dr. Keshara had claimed the science station, where she was already setting up additional monitoring equipment. I've installed sensors specifically calibrated to detect reality alteration events. If your abilities interact with the Devourer physics, we'll have complete recordings. And if my abilities don't work against them? Then we'll have complete recordings of our deaths, Keshara replied cheerfully. Either way, science advances. The Quantum Dart launched from the fleet's flagship and immediately engaged stealth systems that made it virtually invisible to conventional sensors. Sarah watched the evacuation fleet recede behind them as they accelerated toward the inner system, where darkness was spreading across worlds like an infection.
Contact in 20 minutes, Zektar announced.
I recommend we begin with Tertius 4. The evacuation transports were last seen approaching that world before they disappeared. The trip toward the inner system gave Sarah time to study the sensor readings in more detail. The Devourer presence wasn't just consuming matter and energy. It was fundamentally altering the nature of local space. Physics worked differently in areas under their influence, as if reality itself was being rewritten according to alien principles.
It's like they're imposing their own rules, she said, watching gravitational readings that made no sense according to conventional physics. That matches historical accounts, Zektar agreed. The primordials were said to operate by similar principles before their disappearance. They could alter fundamental forces by refusing to accept limitations. What happened to them? Unknown.
Their entire civilization vanished in a single day, leaving behind only empty worlds where the laws of physics behave unpredictably. Zektar's patterns shifted to configurations suggesting ancient fear. Some theorists believe they transcended physical existence entirely. Others suggest they were consumed by entities from dark space. Encouraging, Sarah muttered. Contact, Dr. Keshara announced. Sensors are detecting the remains of the transport convoy ahead. The main display showed the wreckage of dozens of civilian ships, their hulls twisted into impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly. But more disturbing than the destruction was what surrounded it. Areas where space itself seemed to be missing, replaced by something that registered on sensors as absolute void. Life signs? Sarah asked. Negative. But Keshara frowned at her readings. I'm detecting energy signatures that might be preserved neural patterns. The Devourers may not have completely consumed the civilian crews. Sarah felt a chill. Are you saying they're keeping people alive for some reason? I'm saying the energy signatures are consistent with consciousness matrices preserved in exotic matter substrates.
Keshara's skin had gone pale blue with horror.
They may be storing living minds for later consumption. Or conversion, Zektar added grimly. Historical accounts mention Devourer-controlled beings that retained memories and personality traits from their original forms. Sarah studied the wreckage field, looking for patterns that might explain what the Devourers were doing. The destroyed ships formed a rough circle around one of the void zones, as if they'd been arranged deliberately. And at the center of the formation, there, she said, pointing to her area where space seemed to be folded inside out. Something's moving in that void zone. The sensors focused on the area Sarah had indicated, and the display showed something that made everyone on the bridge fall silent. Floating in the absolute darkness was a structure that looked like it was built from crystallized mathematics, geometric forms that existed in too many dimensions, connected by angles that couldn't exist in normal space. Devourer construct, Zektar said quietly. I've never seen one so elaborate. The structure pulsed with energies that made the ship's instruments fluctuate wildly, but more disturbing than its alien geometry was what surrounded it. Hundreds of glowing points that seemed to be floating freely in the void. Neural patterns, Dr. Keshara confirmed. Preserved consciousness matrices from the destroyed transport crews. They're being held in some kind of suspension field. A trap, Sarah realized. They're using the civilian crews as bait, counting on us to attempt a rescue. Do we attempt it anyway? Zektar asked. Sarah studied the alien construct, trying to understand its purpose through her developing sensitivity to reality alteration. The structure existed partially outside normal space-time, but she could see the places where it anchored itself to conventional physics. Like the quantum-edge weapons she'd neutralized, it was impressive but ultimately just another set of rules about how things were supposed to work. Yes, she said, engaging the ship's maneuvering thrusters. But not the way they're expecting. Cadet Chen, Zektar said carefully. What exactly are you planning? I'm going to teach some aliens from dark space why humans don't like bullies. The quantum dart accelerated toward the Devourer construct, its stealth systems masking their approach until they were almost on top of the alien structure. Sarah could feel something pressing against her mind as they got closer, a presence that was vast, ancient, and absolutely hostile to everything she represented. The Devourers had noticed them. The presence that touched Sarah's mind felt like drowning in liquid darkness while being dissected by something that existed in too many dimensions. It spoke without words, communicated through concepts that bypassed language entirely, and its first message was a mixture of hunger, amusement, and anticipation that made her skin crawl. Interesting. The small fleshing that breaks reality. We have been curious about your kind. Sarah gritted her teeth and focused on the ship's controls, trying to ignore the alien thoughts pressing against her consciousness. They're trying to establish mental contact, she announced. Resist at all costs, Zektar warned, his pattern shifting to combat configuration. Devourer mental influence can corrupt consciousness matrices permanently. We do not see to corrupt, we see to understand. Your species alters fundamental laws through mechanisms we have not encountered. This requires study,
They want to study me, Sarah said, bringing the quantum dart closer to the alien construct. Apparently reality alteration is new to them. Dr. Keshara looked up from her instruments, her skin cycling through rapid color changes. That's impossible. The Devourers operate by altering physical laws constantly. How could human abilities be unfamiliar to them? The construct ahead of them pulsed with energies that made space itself ripple like water. As they approached, Sarah could see more details of its impossible architecture. Structures that folded through dimensions that didn't exist, connected by geometries that hurt to contemplate. And floating throughout the construct, the preserved consciousness matrices of thousands of civilians glowed like captured stars. Our methods are consumption and absorption. We remake reality by incorporating it into ourselves. Your species performs alteration through different principles. We must understand these principles. Different principles? Sarah thought about that as she maneuvered the ship around energy fields that could probably disintegrate planets. What do they mean? Unknown, Zektar replied, but his patterns suggested he was developing theories. Perhaps their reality alteration functions through different mechanisms than yours. Demonstrate your capabilities, fleshithing. Show us how you unmake what is real. Sarah suddenly understood what the Devourers wanted. This wasn't a trap designed to capture her, it was an experiment designed to study her abilities. They had arranged the civilian consciousness matrices as both bait and test subjects, counting on her humanity to force her into a demonstration of reality alteration under controlled conditions. They're treating us like lab rats, she said. Laboratory subjects. Yes. We learn much from studying how different species approach the dissolution of natural law. Your methods will be incorporated into our understanding. The construct began to shift, its impossible architecture rearranging itself into new configurations. The floating consciousness matrices drew closer together, forming complex patterns that somehow reminded Sarah of neural networks or computer circuits. They're using the preserved minds to build some kind of processing matrix. Dr. Keshada said, her instruments detecting energy flows between the captured consciousnesses. I think they're planning to use the civilian crews to analyze whatever you do. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, the cold, focused anger that humans had perfected through millennia of warfare. The Devourers weren't just feeding on these people, they were turning them into unwilling participants in research that would probably be used to consume entire civilizations more efficiently. How's this for a demonstration, she muttered, and reached out with abilities she was still learning to understand. The construct was vast and complex, anchored to reality through exotic matter fields that existed partially outside normal space-time. But Sarah wasn't trying to destroy it directly. Instead, she focused on the fundamental assumptions that allowed it to exist. The alien physics that permitted matter to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The energy patterns that kept impossible geometries stable. The field equations that let consciousness exist independently of biological substrates. For a moment, she saw the construct as the Devourers saw it, a logical extension of natural law. A technology that worked by understanding and exploiting the universe's underlying principles. It was impressive, sophisticated, and utterly dependent on very specific interpretations of how reality was supposed to function. Sarah smiled and convinced the universe that those interpretations were wrong. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The construct's impossible geometry collapsed into normal three-dimensional space, its exotic matter fields reverting to conventional physics. Structures that had existed in folded dimensions were suddenly forced to occupy the same spatial coordinates, creating matter density problems that resolved through spectacular explosions. But Sarah wasn't finished. As the alien architecture collapsed, she reached out to the consciousness matrices floating throughout the wreckage and reminded the universe that living minds belonged in living bodies. Thousands of points of light suddenly blazed brighter, then began to fade, as the exotic matter substrates holding them dissolved. For a moment, Sarah thought she had just killed everyone the Devourers had captured. Then her senses detected something impossible. Massive energy discharge, Dr. Keshara announced, her voice filled with awe. The consciousness matrices are materializing? Throughout the collapsing construct, human and alien forms were taking shape as the preserved minds found new physical vessels. The process was chaotic and incomplete. Most of the materialized beings were clearly struggling with newly created bodies, but they were undeniably alive and free from devourer influence. I am possible. Consciousness cannot be restored to matter without energy source. Mass energy conservation prevents. Mass energy conservation is more of a guideline than a rule.
Sarah interrupted the alien thoughts. Especially when you're dealing with someone from a death world who learned physics by surviving things that wanted to eat her. The devourer presence in her mind recoiled, and Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not the simple fear of physical destruction, but the deeper terror of encountering something that operated by completely unknown principles. What are you? I'm human, Sarah replied, bringing the quantum dart around to collect the materialized civilians. We're the species that looked at an ice age and decided to invent agriculture. We're the ones who saw predators with better teeth and claws and decided to make better tools. We're the people who turned a death world into a paradise by refusing to accept that anything was impossible. She focused her abilities on the remaining devourer presence, not trying to destroy it, but to understand its nature. What she found was both illuminating and disturbing. The devourers weren't native to this universe. They came from a place where different physical laws applied, where reality was more fluid, and consciousness could exist independently of matter. In their native environment, they were probably perfectly normal entities operating by logical principles. The problem was that they had brought their native physics with them, imposing alien natural laws on a universe that worked differently. They weren't evil in any meaningful sense. They were simply catastrophically incompatible with local reality. We seek only sustenance, energy to maintain existence in this hostile environment. Then maybe you should go home, Sarah suggested, or at least stop turning people into computer components. The conversation was interrupted by alerts from the ship's sensors. More devourer constructs were materializing throughout the system, their alien architectures rising from folded space like dark flowers blooming. But these structures were different from the research facility they had just destroyed. They looked like weapons. They're bringing in military assets, Zektar observed, studying the tactical display. At least 40 combat constructs, with more appearing every minute. The experiment must continue. Your capabilities must be understood. Compliments will be enforced. That sounds like a threat, Sarah said. I don't like threats. What happened next would become the subject of academic study for centuries to come, assuming galactic civilization survived to write academic papers. Sarah didn't attack the Devourer fleet directly. Instead, she attacked the fundamental assumptions that allowed them to exist in this universe at all. The alien constructs were anchored to local space through complex field equations that translated their native physics into forms that could function in normal reality. Sarah found those translation protocols and convinced the universe that they contained critical errors. One by one, the Devourer war machines found themselves operating.